This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update with Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel begins today's show. Derrell discusses the market and also gives a recap from his recent travels to Mexico and how their cattle market is doing. Keeping the show rolling are K-State Extension agronomists Tina Sullivan and Logan Simon as they explain optimal corn seeding rates and factors for people to consider before their planters hit the fields. Jena Schwartze, graduate research assistant in K-State's Department of Agronomy, ends the show talking about a cover crop survey she is asking growers to take the time to complete. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
You bet. Great to be here.
Derrell, what are we seeing for the cash cattle market?
You know, all the cash markets have been very strong recently, both feeder cattle and fed cattle. We've set, of course, record levels thus far this year, and these markets really strong. Now, some of that for at least the lightweight calves as well as the feeder cattle could be a bit seasonal. We're approaching the time of year when we might see a seasonal peak. But that said, I don't know that I look for much pullback in those markets. We'll see going forward, but I think the seasonality will be somewhat muted this year. We just have a very strong trend in place in this market.
What about for futures?
Futures markets, of course, futures are what they do what they're supposed to do, which is anticipate a lot of things that could happen. In many cases, hopefully they don't happen. And so, they're very volatile. They've been up and down, but generally, particularly for feeder cattle futures, kind of playing catch up to the cash market. And they've closed that gap a little bit. Futures have been a little slow to sort of accept the reality of where we are with these very tight numbers and the implications that has for cash prices.
So as we have seen more strength in the market, do you really think we're going to see a lack of a lot of the usual seasonality cycle that we commonly see?
It's certainly possible because I do expect on average to see higher prices as we go through the year. So if the market is trending up, the seasonality that we normally talk about is based on a stable market. So if the market is otherwise not trending anywhere, you see that kind of seasonal pattern. If you have an uptrend in place, then the seasonal lows that might happen in the middle of the year or later may be muted somewhat with that uptrend offsetting part of that.
What are we seeing for boxed beef?
Boxed beef has really bounced back strongly over the last couple of weeks. Now, right at the end of last week, it actually pulled back just slightly, but it's been very strong again. As we move into April here, we would expect to start seeing at the wholesale level some of the seasonal buying. Buying for Memorial Day will happen in April, about a month ahead of time. And so we'll start to see that. So we'll be watching that going forward to see indications of that seasonal summer demand and the strength in that.
Is that something that you think will stay strong as we enter grilling season with Memorial Day?
Well, I think relatively so. The one thing about all this uncertainty that we have out there now, broadly speaking, political, macroeconomic, or whatever, is that could impact consumers. So that's probably the biggest threat overall to the cattle industry is just the fact that we might actually, impact consumer demand if we have at least some potential to trigger a recession here. And if that happens, then, we could see some impacts on consumers. It's not really something I'm predicting, and it's been remarkably robust, but it is certainly a possibility as we go forward.
And as we are here on Monday and closing out the month of March, what did the month of March look like in the cattle market, Derrell?
March was again pretty impressive. Generally speaking, the markets were very strong across the board, whether we're talking feeder cattle or fed cattle or even cull cows for the most part. We've just seen very strong markets. I think the supply fundamentals, which might have gotten masked a little bit earlier with, particularly with some of this external volatility, if you will, really kind of came back into prominence in March and really kind of carried the day.
And so when we look at the cattle market, how many months do you really think helps people give the best picture of how the cattle market has been doing and might be doing in the future?
Yeah, particularly if we look at something like cattle on feed, and we did see a sharp pullback in placements in February, which was very bullish to the market. Some of that probably will be offset in March. As I look at the auction volumes through March, now that we've closed out the month, those volumes were higher compared to last year. They were down in February, which matched the low placement number. Now, this is Oklahoma auction volume, so it's not everything, but sometimes is an indication. And so I say all that to say that placements may bounce back up. I think in general, we're going to see cattle on feed numbers come down over the next few months. It's been slow to do that up until now, but I do think it will happen. And so it doesn't pay to get too excited about 1 month's cattle on feed report. Sometimes you have to look at 2 or 3 months at least to get a sense of kind of how they average out. A lot of times, if you have a change in placements by a week, one way or the other, on the end of the month or the beginning of the month, can kind of skew those numbers for 1 month relative to last year.
How might maybe what you're seeing with the wheat crop drought, do you think that's really going to impact how our cattle numbers, inventory, just overall the cattle market might look in the coming years?
Well, right now there are, well, first of all, on wheat, if there are cattle still out on wheat now, at least in Oklahoma, we're past first hollow stem. So that means that wheat is for graze out. I do think that's happening. The numbers were not large. We never did get a lot of cattle out on wheat last fall. We had so much trouble getting it started. But there are some cattle out there, so they'll be coming off in mid to late May. And so there'll be that. But again, I don't think they're going to show up as a big run of wheat pasture cattle, if you will. That might have been part of what we saw in March with the bigger volumes was some cattle coming off of wheat. It's not unusual to see that. So, but as we go forward, the bottom line, and really the question that's been out there for many months and still is are we retaining heifers? If we start holding back heifers, then those feeder volumes are going to drop pretty sharply, pretty quickly, and that'll show up then in the cattle on feed inventories. It'll pull those down in just a few months' time.
And a lot of times when we talk about the cattle market, we talk about our neighbors and specifically, more recently, Mexico. And you recently had some travels down there, and kind of what were you seeing?
Yeah, I was down in Chihuahua, Mexico, a couple of weeks ago to visit with them. I actually spoke at their annual cattlemen's meeting there in the state of Chihuahua. And they face some really serious challenges. They've had 2 years of very severe drought. And you have to understand, Chihuahua is pretty arid country. It's think southern New Mexico, extend that farther south. And so, they only get about 16 inches of rain on average. But in fact, in the last 28 months, they've only had a little over 19 inches of rain in 28 months, over 2 years. So very, very dry. They've had to liquidate cattle. And all of the challenges of trying to hang on to them through their dry season. And then, of course, the appearance of New World screwworm last November closed the border. So now they're caught in a situation where they're trying to hang on to cattle that they were going to export until they can export them, at the same time that they have no feed, and they're feeding them with purchased feeds, which is extremely expensive. And then the final blow to them right now, as we move into April, is the prospect of tariffs coming into play, and that'll be a further hit on those producers as they try to bring those cattle across the border.
Are other parts of Mexico having similar struggles, or really just northern Mexico?
The drought right now is confined to northern and northwestern Mexico, which is a pretty big cattle area. But in 2023, there was drought pretty widespread across the country. It did improve in central Mexico quite a bit in 2024. So some of the cattle out of northern Mexico the last few months have been relocating farther south into the country, but gives them a little bit of a place to go. But when that border closed, the backlog of feeder cattle that happened initially really kind of flooded the Mexican market. And so there's a pretty big value difference now between Mexican prices and U.S. prices, whereas typically they kind of, they sort of come together based on transportation and other factors to explain the difference in those prices.
What are some really important key factors then that you heard about in Mexico that you think is really important to Oklahoma, Kansas, the cattle market around us?
Well, I've had the question from a number of producers that as we open the border, and the border is open, it's slowly coming back online. It's not up to normal volumes yet. But one of the questions is, are we going to be flooded with this backlog of feeder cattle that didn't get exported in December and January? And the short answer is there's a few more head of cattle. Some of them have had to move in the Mexican market, either because of the drought or because they're spayed heifers and they've run out of time. They only have a certain amount of time to get across the border once they spay those heifers. So the short answer is I don't think it's going to cause any significant ripple that we can detect in markets in the U.S. Now, certainly, if you get into some of the South Texas feedlots and places that count on those Mexican inventories, they're really struggling just to maintain their numbers because that was a part of the supply that they really rely on.
Derrell, if people want to read more on your recent travels, how can they do that?
The best way would be to subscribe to our Cow-Calf Corner newsletter that we write at Oklahoma State. And there's several ways to get that, but one would be to just send me an email at derrell.peel@okstate.edu. Tell me you'd like to get our weekly newsletter, and I'd be happy to put you on the list.
Derrell, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You're very welcome.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. He did recently write an article in the Cow-Calf Corner newsletter on his recent travels to northern Mexico, which I will link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. And as he mentioned, if you would like to get subscribed to it, you can email him at derrell.peel@okstate.edu. That is DERRELL.PEEL@okstate.edu. I will link all this information in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about corn seeding rates with K-State Extension agronomists Logan Simon and Tina Sullivan. Logan, Tina, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
Yep, thanks for having us.
As we're talking about corn seeding rate recommendations, Logan, important to first take a look at maybe how last year performed?
Absolutely. So we always want to be making our decisions for the current year, looking back at our experiences from the past years, and especially thinking about things even on a field-to-field basis. That way we understand, based on our past performance across these acres, what we can expect for the coming year. Based on using experience in that way as the foundation for decision-making, we're able to tailor recommendations such as optimal corn seeding rates to those given fields.
What are some factors from last year that maybe you recommend growers take the time to think about?
Yes, so looking back at our experiences last year, we can look at how our corn crop performed. And so some rules of thumb, for example, would be like too few kernels per ear. So in this case, if more than 5% of plants were barren, or most of our ears had fewer than 250 kernels per ear, that would indicate that our seeding rate was probably too high. At the same time, if we have too many kernels per ear, for example, if there's consistently more than 600 kernels per ear, or most plants have a second ear that actually contributed to our final grain yield, that probably indicates that we didn't have enough plants out there to really be capturing the full yield potential that we had that year. So we can use that information to help us. Another one would be to keep in mind is if we were seeing a phenomenon we call tipping back, where we are not filling kernels all the way out to the tip of that corn ear. It's something that we people don't always really like to see tipping back in their ears, but we don't want to be too concerned if there's, say, like a half inch of the tip of the ear that's not filling. In fact, if kernels had filled all the way to the tip of the ear, that would be yet another indicator that we might have had too few plants out there to meet that maximum yield potential that was there.
And while we're thinking about seeding rates, something while maybe we can't control it perfectly, but take into consideration the weather. And Tina, what are some long-term factors that growers need to consider?
So I was kind of looking forward to this season, kind of talking with the K-State climatologist and our weather folk. As much as we want it to be a good wet year, looking at the models, it's not going to be calling for that. We've already been kind of hot and dry for March after a very cold, wet January and February. Looking forward for temperatures for the seasonal temperatures for April through June, we're at equal to slightly above equal chances of being hotter this season. For precip, we're looking at below average precip for those same months of April through June for the whole state. Not just, Western Kansas, who's, traditionally drier, but all the state is looking at being drier. So if we start thinking about what's our limiting factor for this going into this corn season, it's more than likely going to be precipitation, even in those areas of the state that we kind of traditionally think of them being the wetter portion. We could see less rain showers. And right now, these are projections just into June. If we're still dry going into July and August when we're trying to set our kernels, our yields may take a hit. So it's kind of thinking forward right now. What's our most limiting factor? Could be precip, could just be hotter than usual. So it might not be a bad idea to cut back on our planting rates just because the limiting factor was going to be moisture more than likely. Saving money on corn seed that's not going to produce or be productive it's a good outlook potentially. I was driving through southeast Kansas this week, and there's already corn planters running down to southeast Kansas. So corn planting season is a go in some portions of the state.
What about if maybe changes or things are looking different when it comes to fertilization or irrigation rates?
Absolutely. So we want to be tailoring our recommendations, or our optimal corn seeding rate is going to be related to fertilization, irrigation, and then another important one is hybrid, because we do have some variations in adaptability of our different corn hybrids. So, for example, when we know that we've got that higher level of fertility, or we've got that access to irrigation, we have and in that way, medium to full irrigation, we have the ability to provide at least some consistency to water availability through the growing season with some better assurance of making those higher yield potentials. And so when we know that we've got average to above average fertility, we've got that access to irrigation, that increases the optimum seeding rate to reach those higher levels. At the same time, if we are in a dryland scenario, or a low, you could say lower fertility, but also just thinking rougher ground in general, we're reeling that seeding rate in. We're reeling that in. The way that the hybrid component falls into this is that we do know that some of our hybrids have more ear flex to them than others, meaning that we can be going in with them at a lower, more conservative seeding rate, anticipating drier, hotter conditions, rough year. But having that ability to adapt and maybe put on a second year or something like that to adapt if the environment ends up being better than anticipated.
What are some of the seeding rates for dryland or irrigated corn?
For our irrigated environments, we have full season versus a shorter season. In that full season irrigated environment, our seeding rate is suggested to be pretty high at 33 to 40,000. Yet if we have a shorter season, we should bump it up for more seeds per acre to 35 to 42,500 seeds. While if we're in a limited irrigation environment, we need to actually bump back down to that 28 to 33,000 seeds per acre.
Yeah, in a dryland setting, that's going to have significant variation as we move across the state. Our highest yield potential for dryland corn, or rain-fed, as some of our producers would call it, our highest potential is going to be in northeast Kansas, where on the high end, we're going to be looking at 28 to 33,000 seeds per acre, where on the more medium end, we'll be looking at more of a 26 to 30,000 seeds per acre. As we move into southeast Kansas, we've got a couple different scenarios there with that, again, full season versus short season. For a full season, we'll be looking at 28 to 30,000 seeds per acre, where tightening it back to a short season, especially on some of the rougher ground in southeast Kansas, would be more of a 24 to 26,000. Moving way out west to northwest and southwest Kansas, in northwest, we'll be looking at 19 to 24,000 as our recommended range, but tightening that low end down to 16,000 as you move into southwest Kansas, where we do have the history of being the hottest, driest portion of the state, so we want to be a little bit more conservative on that end. North central Kansas, going to be more similar to northeast, 24 to 26,000, and then finally in south central, be looking at 21 to 26,000.
And as we're talking about these corn seeding rates, K-State has done some research in the past, and what did K-State Research and Extension find from that?
Some of that research kind of found that we were going to start with our little disclaimer. Just because there's an agronomical optimum plant population does not mean it's the economical optimum plant population range. There is a lot, again, it depends on our hybrid, our environment, and what practices are going into it. If a area or a farmer's field is, more susceptible to flash droughts, that's going to cause differences in your yield no matter what a data set says, right? So if we have a low yield environment, the more plants we put per acre, we actually see a negative yield response. The plants are just having to compete with each other too much. Or we like corn to compete with each other, but in that low yield environment, it's a little too much. In our medium yield environment, we're referring to something less than 150 bushels per acre. The research kind of found that seeding rate was flat. It didn't matter if you were doing what we'd refer to a high end or a low end or the medium, right in the middle. It was the same for the yield. We start seeing bigger differences in our high yield, which is 180 bushels per acre, and in a very high yield of 210 bushels per acre, where very high end, we've seen the data kind of just was a straight line up. Keep putting plants per acre, the environment's going to handle it for yield. What we've seen in our high yields, that 180 bushels per acre, at some point, the line starts dipping back down. So we can't actually put too many plants per acre in that environment. So instead of gaining yield, we're hurting ourselves.
Tina, Logan, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
Thanks for having us.
Those were K-State Extension agronomists Logan Simon and Tina Sullivan. There is an e-update article on this topic titled Optimal Corn Seeding Rate Recommendations. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show discussing a cover crop survey with graduate research assistant in K-State's Department of Agronomy, Jena Schwartze. Jena, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for this opportunity.
Jena, what is this survey about?
So basically this survey is trying to gain producers' perspectives on why we should use cover crops in the Great Plains semi-arid region. And so what we're primarily looking at is gaining perspectives from both sides of the spectrum of producers that do incorporate cover crops and producers that don't incorporate cover crops. Some of the questions we look at involve what are they currently doing on their operation, how their management practices are affected, if they utilize them, or utilize cover crops, I should say, and if they don't utilize them, why? Why do they incorporate them? Why don't they? What factors influence their decisions? And if they incorporate them, are they successful? What changes have they seen overall in their operation?
What are you hoping to gain from all this different information then?
So our main goal is just to find out how producers in the semi-arid Great Plains region, how they view cover crops, and especially since water is the most important resource when it comes to cropping systems. And water is very limited, especially when you get out further west, especially in Kansas. And so in these semi-arid regions, we're trying to figure out how producers utilize their water and if cover crops. Sometimes people are concerned, it takes all my water, so I'm not going to plant them. But we're just trying to gain producers' perspectives on if they use them or if they don't use them.
When you say the Great Plains region, is this more than just Kansas doing this work and this research?
Yeah, so we're primarily looking at the states of Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado. That's kind of where my survey is focused, but I am pulling information from everywhere. Like so far, since the survey's been out for about a month and a half, I've gained producers' perspectives from Missouri, Arkansas, Florida, Illinois. So it's open to anyone, but whenever it comes down to it, we're going to bring down those responses to primarily Nebraska, Colorado, and Kansas. But perhaps it goes larger than what we expect it to be, and then we'll maybe make it into a larger survey.
Why is this something that you hope farmers and ranchers care about?
So this is the portion that I fell in love with, and what I hope my future career will be is to work in extension. And I think a primary focus of extension and research specialists is just to figure out what producers need and how can we help them to get the resources they need. And so why should farmers care? Well, we want to know their perspective so we can adjust our research experiments, our programs, so that we can give them the resources they need to have a successful operation overall.
Who else is supporting this survey from Kansas or other organizations?
Yeah, so we have other organizations we are currently coordinating with are the Colorado Conservation Tillage Association, or known as CCTA, and the Kansas Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. We have partnered with them to help distribute our survey as well as just get the information out there. And some of the information that we share on the survey may also be used to update their programs.
Who else with K-State is involved?
Yeah, so myself, as well as Dr. Augustina Bohr, who is a soil scientist out in the Western Kansas Research Center area, and Dr. Logan Simon, who is the Southwest area agronomist. We have built the survey and have published it and put it out along with CCTA and NRCS for Kansas.
Where can people find this survey if they're interested and willing to take it?
Yeah, so the easiest way I can describe this is to go to the K-State Agronomy e-update. If you Google search K-State Agronomy e-update, cover crop survey, the first thing that should pop up is our survey. And the title of that may pop up is Join the Conversation on Cover Crops. Join this new survey today. And it was recently published in the e-update on March 13th. We also have it posted on other social media sites like the Kansas Association of Conservation Districts. Their Facebook page has also worked with us to help distribute the survey, which I'm super grateful for. And we also have it published in other local magazines as well, such as the Kansas Farmer. And so, but definitely the easiest way is probably the Agronomy e-update.
When are you hoping that this survey concludes, or what's kind of that deadline?
We don't have a hard date, but we're looking at mid-May. And so hopefully by the time the semester's over and I don't have as many classes to worry about, once the summer rolls around, look into this data and just start analyzing it all and figuring out how our producers view cover crops in this region.
That was Graduate Research Assistant in K-State's Department of Agronomy, Jena Schwartze. I will link this survey in today's show notes on agtoday.net. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.